the saying, a child should be seen but not heard? Yep. And what is the evidence that a child has been present somewhere around you? Doesn't matter where, but what are some of the evidential things that tell us children have been around? Toys everywhere, good one. Stickiness, general stickiness. They're right there, your friend, Jude. When it's a messy room and you can't walk through it, good. All great evidence that children have been present. Today, Jesus uses the example of a child to teach the church and us. Unless you learn how to welcome a child among you, you have not learned to be a servant. Jesus reminds us that as a follower of him, we have to learn that the child is welcome, but not just the child. What is welcome amongst us is the stickiness that goes along with that, is the mess, is the constant picking up after. It's finding the toys laid around. In essence, it's realizing that we welcome people for being a child of God, and all that comes with being a child. We do not welcome them for money or power or prosperity or leadership. We welcome people for all of those reasons as well in the church. But we are reminded that as the church, we welcome the stickiness and the messiness. And we don't want to be a place that says a child should be seen and not heard. Today, in our lesson in the gospel, there are two instances where words are not spoken. First of all, the disciples didn't understand what Jesus was talking about. Jesus was teaching about his suffering and death and also the resurrection. And they did not understand what he was saying, and they were afraid to ask him, is what we read in Mark 9:32. They did not understand, and they were afraid to ask. And when someone is afraid and they don't ask, it creates a culture of silence. And when a culture of silence is created, although it sounds a little bit like children should be seen and not heard, can you imagine what it would be like raising a child without ever speaking with them, without ever listening to their heart in their stories, without ever asking, how was your day? Without saying, how did you get that Band-Aid on your elbow, or where did the black eye come from? That would be no good way to raise a child. The other part of silence in the gospel today, it talks about when they arrived into a city. In the end of verse 33, Jesus says, "What were you arguing about on your way?" Verse 34 reads, "But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest." And that's when Jesus used the child to say, you should not worry about who is the greatest. You should figure out how to listen and how to take care of the child among you. And all of us are a child of God. I know parenting is tiring. Adulting is tiring. Being a leader can be tiring. Whatever position and authority you have, it can be tiring, especially if you think the only thing you're doing is cleaning up after someone else. And yet that is the analogy and the image Jesus uses. At the time when Jesus took this child and placed it in front of them, children were not very powerful. They did not have many rights. They were not looked upon as great blessings. They certainly weren't taken to early music lessons to learn how to play music. They were not playing sports from the time they were toddlers on up. They were not the chief principle of a family's life or a community. There weren't even schools to teach them how to read and write. The children were very low on the totem pole. And Jesus said, these you should learn to welcome. Welcome people who are honest and cry when they're hurt. Welcome people who will constantly make you ask them questions to understand them. Welcome people who need reassurance and affirmation and hugs and re-explanation and the same story told again and again. Jesus says, welcome those amongst you who are honest enough to cry out when they are hurt. They will not be quiet. Oh my goodness, children say the darndest things. There used to be a show called that. And if you ever watch videos on Facebook, you see a lot of cute kids saying things. But that is why they are a blessing, is because they speak out, they are not silent. We live in a culture where silence has taken over us at times when, like the gospel, we find there are things that are hard to understand, or when we know we have made a mistake and done something wrong. We create a culture of silence nationally by treating countries around the United States who are impoverished or have no value of their land or wealth or natural resources by not having much of a voice. We create this culturally as we only listen sometimes to CEOs or large donors to organizations or power people. And we're being taught today that when we don't understand something or when we've done something wrong, that actually speaking out is a good thing. I know as a dad, it is tiring to parent, but we want to hear from our kids, and we are encouraged not to tire. Even as a church organization, we are encouraged not to tire from being the church. I know sometimes it seems like we are cleaning up after the same group of people or the same thing that happens over and over again, and yet that is what parenting and teaching is all about. We welcome into our midst people who may not have lots of this or that to offer, and they do have a lot of listening and cleaning up to do after them, and we are told to welcome that amongst us. I know on the sound system, every so often it seems like the buttons get pushed wrong or something happens differently, and next thing you know, it's not recording right. And yet, as the leaders of the sound system, we are told to welcome volunteers and teach and train to try to correct, but know that it will happen over and over again. Sometimes in our culture, we've created such a verge of silence based on things we don't understand or things maybe we've done wrong that we're afraid to talk about them. There's a very good example going on in the public right now about such a creation. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of the hashtag Me Too movement. It's an empowerment movement that is all about breaking silence, especially of women who have been harassed or abused in their lifetime, but also for men and boys and anyone else to talk about abuse that has come at the hands of someone else. We've created this cloak and culture of silence. Oftentimes it's associated with the power of men who used to run everything and now just run most things. But people want to have a voice to share what's happened with them. And victims don't want to speak out. Victims don't want to share their story because of our culture and because perhaps they were someplace they shouldn't be or doing something they shouldn't do. Or maybe culture will say they were dressed wrong. You know, some of you women who are in the room are really old. Yep. And I'm not saying who. But what I do want to say is this: if you worked in the professional world when you were a young gal, you really couldn't say or do anything if your boss wanted to come by and pat you on the fanny or make other suggestive words or comments to you. That's not the world we live in today, but it's the world we came from. I've heard stories from people I love a great deal about the abuse that they've taken from others. I read some stories my sister posted about horrible things that happened to her in and around our high school years. And I'm just now hearing them because she's just now telling the stories. We create a culture that sometimes we forget. It is the child amongst us who cries out for help that we are to listen to pick up, hold, and embrace, and not describe why it is they're crying or blame them for their tears, but rather embrace them. In our church, we have a beautiful gift to offer the world, because the world is crying. This hashtag Me Too movement, as people try to talk about what's happened in their life, is totally being polarized in the midst of a political appointment of a Supreme Court judge. I don't think a Democrat or a Republican could ever sit down with me and argue with me and tell me why their religion and their faith is the prominent thing in their life. It's all team sport in my eyes. Politicians do not live their faith. They simply monopolize their faith to make one point or another for another vote. If you're a staunch Republican or Democrat, I apologize to you for my limited understanding of the way I see faith and politics living their life out together, but I don't think they're congruent and go together. What I do think is when someone cries, they need someone to hold them and listen and hear their story and provide healing. And that is the gift the church has to offer the world around us. It is why we say and stress here at Zion that all are welcome, all. And then it is also why it is difficult to bring that to life in and amongst us. When there's only so few who do the work in the leadership, it can be tiring and frustrating as we look around and see the rest. But where God has called you to lead and act and perform and give and do whatever it is, or give whatever you can, please do so. And know that we are supposed to create this open and welcome environment for the child who is defenseless and needs our teaching, our love, our help, and our guidance. We're to create the space of healing and teaching that God so lovingly offers us without judgment. When I pronounced the forgiveness portion of the confession and forgiveness, I really accentuated this service the way it started. God hears our cry and sends the Spirit to change us and empower our lives in the world. Our sins are forgiven. God's love is unconditional. When you come in this place and cry, whether it is out loud or silent, God hears that cry and embraces you. Friday night at the hospital, as I rotated through the NICU, the nurses were terribly busy in one nursery, and yet there was one infant crying a lot. There were no cuddlers available. These are volunteers who come just to hold these premature babies to help them. And so I asked, "Do you want me to hold that baby?" And they said yes. And so I held for a half an hour a little shaver fighting for life as he tries to grow and become big, so that the nurses could take care of the other infants. Today we are reminded God hears our cries. Today as a church we are reminded through the gospel, don't buy into a culture of silence and power and authority. Rather, welcome amongst us, Jesus says, the child, the one whom all look upon as being always taking and never giving, but the one whom we listen for their cry, so that when we hear their voice, we may hold to help heal. That is what our church speaks of and has to offer for all who come through the doors. Together, we lead and be as strong as we can so that we are ready to hold and help heal through God's unconditional love all who are in need. Amen.